Few people have the courage to say this out loud, but there comes a time in life when the constant presence of friends is no longer essential. This doesn't mean isolation, loneliness, or giving up, but rather a natural and profound change in how we see life and relate to the world. At 70 or older, the focus shifts. The priority is no longer long conversations, frequent get-togethers, or social gatherings. What matters now is inner peace, clarity about who you are, and the freedom to simply be with yourself without demands. Many seniors are surprised to realize that, even with fewer contacts, they don't feel lonely. On the contrary, they feel more whole, more peaceful, and more connected to something that goes beyond appearances. And it's right there that an important discovery begins to emerge. There's a profound difference between being alone and feeling lonely. When you reach this stage of life consciously, loneliness ceases to be a problem and becomes a choice. It's at this point that the teachings of Edgar Cayce gain strength. He said that the true development of the self doesn't happen amidst the noise, but in silence. It's in this silence that the most important answers begin to emerge. And the more mature a person is, the more they realize that many friendships were sustained only by habit, convenience, or fear of being alone. This video isn't an incentive to withdraw, but an invitation to reflect on what truly makes sense today. If you've already reached 70 or are approaching it, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Here, the conversation is direct, honest, and made especially for those who value the wisdom of maturity. Over time, we begin to understand that many relationships demand more than they offer. Conversations that once seemed pleasant become repetitive. Encounters that once filled us now seem empty. Patience diminishes not out of intolerance, but because vital energy begins to be directed toward what's essential. Have you ever noticed this? That desire to be silent, to not have to explain anything, to simply observe. That's not discouragement, it's evolution. And there's nothing wrong with that. When we understand this, we stop looking for company just to avoid being alone. And we begin to choose more carefully the few people who truly deserve the little time we have left. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It comes slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide receding without fanfare. First, you notice that you no longer feel so eager to answer the phone. Then you start avoiding encounters that demand emotional effort. And finally, you realize that the best moments of the day are those when you're alone, with your thoughts, without external noise. This doesn't mean that others have lost their value. It just means that the value is now within. Edgar Cayce affirmed that the cycles of life require seclusion at certain times, because it's in the pause that the spirit reorganizes itself. Many seniors report a strange feeling at first, as if they're distancing themselves too much. But over time, they understand that it's precisely this distancing that brings them closer to themselves. It's not about cutting ties with everyone, but about understanding which ties still make sense. At this point in life, you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You've already loved, lost, been mistaken, trusted wrongly, started over. You've lived enough to know that not all that glitters is gold, and that many people only show up when everything is fine. True friendship shows itself in silence, in the absence of demands, in the freedom of not having to be present all the time. And, curiously, it's when you distance yourself a little that you discover who really cares. The connections that withstand time and distance are the only ones worth keeping. Everything else is noise, and noise at this stage tires more than it helps. As we grow older, our perception of time changes. Each hour seems more valuable, each day more precious. And then an inevitable question arises. Who is it worth spending the little time we have left with? It's at this moment that quantity loses out to quality. Having a huge group of friends ceases to be an advantage. What matters is having peace. Many seniors report that even having only one or two close people, they feel more welcomed than when they lived surrounded by people. This happens because maturity teaches us to see beyond the surface. Constant presence may be comfortable, but it's not always sincere. Silence may seem empty, but it's often where the deepest truth resides. Some insist that aging well depends on maintaining an active social life. Of course, human contact is important, but it doesn't need to be constant to be meaningful. At 70, you have the right to choose who you want to talk to, when, and for how long. There's no more room for social obligations that only generate wear and tear. Cayce warned that the spirit needs rest to strengthen itself, and this includes protecting oneself from empty interactions. Often the silence of an evening, the smell of coffee, reading a good book, or a simple look at the sky offer more company than hours of conversation that say nothing. It's not selfishness. It's wisdom. It's the recognition that you no longer need to mold yourself to please. This recognition changes everything. You begin to review your history, to realize that many of the bonds you cultivated were fragile, based on fleeting interests. Fair-weather friends, casual acquaintances, routine acquaintances. When these figures disappear, what remains is a strange feeling of relief, not because they were bad, but because they no longer made sense. Little by little, you understand that being surrounded by people doesn't always mean being well accompanied, and that in fact the best company one can have is that which allows you to be exactly as you are, without effort. It's there that emotional freedom settles in, a freedom that only comes with time and with the courage to accept one's own path. It's common to hear that loneliness kills, but they don't always explain that there are types of loneliness that heal. There's the loneliness that isolates and saddens, but there's also the one that organizes, that clarifies thoughts, that calms the heart. That's the one we're talking about here, the one that's born from choice and not rejection, the one that allows you to listen to yourself without interference. Cayce spoke of the importance of recollection as a natural stage of mature life. It's in this recollection that many answers arise. It's in this silent space that anxieties go away and gratitude takes their place. You begin to look at simple things with more attention. A flower that blooms, a bird that sings, the sound of the wind. Small details that previously went unnoticed gain new value. This new look brings a kind of serene joy, different from the euphoria of youth. It's a quiet joy that doesn't need to be shared all the time. It comes from the understanding that life no longer needs to be accelerated, that it's no longer necessary to chase after anything. You've already built, already lost, already learned. Now it's time to simply be. Many mistake this for giving up, but it has nothing to do with that. It's a deeper way of living, with less noise and more essence. When you distance yourself from relationships that only took up space, space opens up for something much greater, the connection with yourself. And this connection, despite being silent, is the most powerful of all. At certain moments, nature itself teaches this. A tree doesn't need the company of others to flourish. It follows its cycle, firm, peaceful, even when no one is watching. So is the senior who learns to value their presence. They don't need an audience, confirmation, forced company. They need time, peace, meaning. And that's why many, when they pass 70, begin to naturally distance themselves from old social circles, not out of resentment, but out of understanding. They understand that the presence of others should be pleasant, never mandatory. And that if it's not like that, it's better to go it alone, because the silence that welcomes is always better than the speech that hurts. Of course, there's still room for true friendships, but these show themselves differently. They don't demand, they don't pressure, they don't intrude. They're there when they need to be, and that's enough. They're rare, discreet, firm. And the more time passes, the more you realize that you don't need many friends to be happy. You need peace, lightness, truth. And sometimes that truth is only in the silence of a quiet morning. Cayce said that the mature soul doesn't seek noise but understanding, and this understanding doesn't come from others, but from within. That's what makes the senior not only accept, but desire moments of solitude, because it's in them that they find themselves, listen to themselves, understand themselves. Over the years, many realize that the most significant encounters in life don't happen in groups but in moments. Sometimes it's a quick conversation with someone at the bus stop, a glance exchanged in the market, a simple gesture of kindness. These moments say more than hours of dialogue with people who don't truly listen. The elderly heart no longer seeks quantity but quality. That's why so many feel more fulfilled after they stop trying to maintain an extensive network of friends. They learn that they don't always need to be available, that the time they have should be respected and not consumed by social commitments that no longer make sense. Society insists on saying that it's necessary to always be surrounded by people to age healthily. But it forgets to mention that mental and emotional health also depend on rest, introspection, and silence. It's common to see seniors smiling alone on their walks, reading calmly in a square, or sitting on the porch looking at the horizon. These little moments say a lot. They show that happiness after 70 doesn't come from agitation, but from serenity. Cayce affirmed that the spirit, when at peace, doesn't need distractions. It's self-sufficient. And that's not isolation. It's maturity. It's being whole even in silence. There's no rule that defines what the social life of an older person should be like. Everyone has their own rhythm, their own needs, their own way of living. But what this video proposes is a more honest look at what many feel but don't have the courage to say. The truth is that after a certain age, it's liberating to admit that you no longer need friends in number, but in meaning. That the absence of forced relationships is a gift, not a loss. That alone time is a right, not a punishment, and that you don't need to justify this choice to anyone. When this awareness arrives, a lot is reorganized inside, and what seemed empty begins to have meaning. There's a certain relief in realizing that it's no longer necessary to meet the expectations of others. For decades, life is marked by social obligations, constant commitments, attempts to please and maintain relationships that often don't bring emotional return. But after 70, this need disappears. You begin to choose what you really want to do, who you really want to be with, and when this choice leads to silence, there's nothing wrong. It's an achievement. Cayce said that true spiritual freedom is only achieved when the individual detaches from the need for external approval. And that's what many discover at this stage of life. Another important point is respect for one's own time. Younger friends may not understand this change. They may think you're distancing yourself, that you've lost interest, that you're sad. But it's not about that. It's about respecting your own rhythm. At 70 or older, waking up without rushing, having coffee in silence, taking care of your plants, or just watching the world is already a form of fulfillment. You no longer need to explain this to anyone. And if someone doesn't understand, perhaps they never truly understood who you are. Therefore, maintaining few solid bonds is healthier than insisting on maintaining many fragile ones. It's also important to recognize that this change may cause strangeness at first. After all, we were taught to value the presence of others as a synonym for happiness. But maturity shows that the opposite can also be true. Silence can be therapeutic. Solitude can be invigorating. When you learn to appreciate your own company, you discover a source of peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. Cayce spoke about the importance of looking inward and reconnecting with what's essential. And there's nothing more essential than your own presence. When you're okay with yourself, everything else becomes secondary. Many seniors report that after accepting this new phase, they began to feel less anxiety. The demands decreased, the external noise ceased, and the body reacted with more lightness. It's as if the mind, previously overloaded by so many obligations and interactions, could finally breathe. When you stop trying to maintain connections just to appear sociable, there's more energy left to take care of yourself. This includes doing activities you really enjoy, maintaining simple habits, sleeping better, eating more mindfully. Cayce reinforced that spiritual balance was also reflected in the body. And the tranquility that comes from solitude, when well understood, is a silent remedy that heals without fanfare. Of course, some losses hurt. Old friendships dissolve, loved ones pass away, memories insist on returning. But even this has its value. When remembering what happened, you see how much you lived, and by noticing who stayed, you understand the value of permanence. True friendships don't need to be daily to be real. Sometimes a phone call a month says more than forced weekly meetings, and sometimes not even that. It's enough to know that there's respect, that there's affection, even from a distance. Physical absence doesn't annul emotional connection. On the contrary, in many cases it strengthens it, because sincere longing doesn't demand presence, only recognition. Therefore, when reaching 70, it's natural that priorities change. You've already come a long way and don't need to walk in a group to feel safe anymore. The journey is now more internal than external, and there's nothing wrong with that. Contrary to what they say, it's not the lack of friends that defines the quality of this phase. It's the clarity about what really matters, And what matters can be something as simple as the silence of an evening or the pleasure of finishing a book forgotten on the shelf. There's no rule, there's no right or wrong. There's only the freedom to choose what feels good. And if that means being more alone, so be it, because peace at this stage is worth more than any forced company. This understanding, despite being simple, is one of the most liberating that can be achieved. After so long adapting to the needs of others, living according to your own rules brings a feeling of deep relief. You no longer need to maintain masks, fulfill roles, or follow expectations. Time becomes yours. And each decision, however small it may seem, gains more value. Edgar Cayce said that the spirit matures when it turns inward, and that's exactly what happens when one accepts one's own company. It's not about rejecting others, but about welcoming oneself. And this welcoming is the greatest gift someone can give themselves after 70. Deep down, we all seek meaning. And as the years go by, we realize that this meaning isn't outside, but inside. It's not something that others bring, but something we build with time, with reflection, with conscious choices. Every time you choose to be at peace instead of pleasing, you get closer to who you really are. And ironically, it's at this moment that the most true connections arise. Those that don't need to be forced, that don't require effort, that simply happen. And even if they are few, they are enough. Because when there is truth, it doesn't take much for there to be meaning. It's enough to be at peace with yourself. If you've made it this far, perhaps you've already felt all of this. Perhaps you're already at that point in life where silence speaks louder than words and solitude becomes company. If that's the case, know that you're not alone. There are many others who, like you, are rediscovering the value of their own presence. If this video touched you in some way, like, comment, and share with someone who also deserves to hear this. And if you're not yet subscribed, join us. Here the conversation is sincere, respect is a priority, and the search is for a lighter and more meaningful life. Because in the end, it's not about how many are by our side, but about how we choose to be with ourselves.